what we're seeing happen in Gaza I think, is the biggest moral crisis of our time. It's amazing to see the mental gymnastics our government and people that support Israel do to justify what is happening here. I mean, this is an enclave of about 2 million people that have been pushed into a tiny sliver of land that are walled in, where 50% of the people are children, and they are being indiscriminately bombed, with 70% of the dead being women and children. I don't know if we've ever seen anything quite like this before. And somehow we can still justify and say that this is all Hamas's fault and Israel needs to defend itself, and we are fully complicit in this. And it makes me wonder, because, we always, in history, we hear about the Holocaust, and we read about these past atrocities, and we always think, well, we can never be part of something like this. There's no way that this could happen to us. But here we are. And we are allowing it to happen. We're supporting it. We are making it happen. And I'm just wondering, how do we live with ourselves moving forward? There has to be a recognition at some point, and then say, most of the people we killed were women and children. Is that okay? Like, how is that ever acceptable? It's staring you right in the face. Everybody knows it. People report it. You see it on BBC News. 70% women and children. And somehow we think that, yeah, it's okay. So I guess my question is, what will this do to us? Do you believe that this is the biggest moral crisis of our lifetime?
Yeah, no, I do. It is a huge moral crisis. There's no question about it. And I would say, our support for Israel, which obviously goes back, long precedes October 7th, has been corrupting. Now, one thing I was listening to, I think it was Professor David Gibbs. I listened to an interview of his maybe just a couple of weeks ago. But he made the point I think was very interesting and very true about the neocons. We've talked about the neocons and their globalist vision. They're former Trotskyites, and they have this idea of, worldwide revolution. So again, now we're not talking about communism, that they converted from Trotskyism, which is a form of Marxism, to the U.S. way, we'll just say. And so, we need to have a world revolution where, every markets and liberal democracy are instituted in every country around the world. That's the neocon vision. But a part of it, again, a lot of these people, not all of them, but especially the initial group, was almost entirely Jewish. And part of their motivation, a big part of it really was linked to Israel. And one thing is they were admirers of the Israeli way of doing things, meaning that the Israelis didn't seem to show any compunction. Now, this was decades ago. They're actually, things have gotten a lot worse since then. But already, they were sort of like the Israelis didn't hold back. The Israelis took off their gloves. This is something that we need to learn to do too. We have been too timid, let's say, in our dealings with other countries. We have to be forceful like the Israelis. There's this admiration. And you can see that it's happened. It's really changed and corrupted our own government, the hearts and minds of our people. You're just, you gave the example of that Florida legislator. Unfortunately, those kind of comments are all too common. Now, I think I mentioned in some previous program that roughly 20 years ago, George W. Bush, he actually criticized the Israelis for causing the deaths of too many civilians in an attack on a Hamas leader. We're talking about single digits. But to take out this one Hamas leader, several innocent civilians were killed. And he actually criticized them for that. Now, of course, recently with Nasrallah, the assassination of Nasrallah in Beirut, it took out an entire apartment block. We're talking about a huge residential apartment building. And there are hundreds, we're talking about hundreds of civilians that were killed in that. And not only was there no criticism, but that is being celebrated. That's one thing that I was really struck by. Like, for example, in the Witkoff interview, he and Tucker Carlson, just kind of celebrated this assassination. They didn't seem to be concerned that these hundreds of civilians were killed at the same time. And now we can see it actually on the attacks on Yemen. It's like we're almost envious of the Israelis. Again, they take the gloves off. They don't give a damn about all this, humanitarian stuff. They just know to go for the jugular, and we got to do that too. And that's what we've seen. Like, for example, an attack on the Houthis. There was that. Those classified or conversations, of course, that were released by Jonathan Goldberg. Vice President Vance and Hegseth and whatever were discussing the attack.
Goldberg.
Yeah, Jeffrey Goldberg. What did I say? Did I say Jonathan? Jeffrey. Yeah, it's Jeffrey Goldberg. Absolutely. They were discussing the attack on Yemen, and they mentioned that there was some, Houthi leader who was he had been spotted going into an apartment building, where apparently to visit his girlfriend, and they took out the apartment building, and they all applauded it. Great, again, how many civilians were killed? I mean, that's the thing. It's just that there's just where at least there was, I know you can find many exceptions. Like, of course, the worst ones are in World War II and the bombing of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. Also the bombings of Dresden and Hamburg and in Germany, where many, many civilians were killed. But there was a lot of people who actually were concerned about that in the West afterwards, and it was there was a certain amount of self-recrimination. We did it. It was horrible, but there was some discussion about the moral questionableness of this approach, but you just don't see it. It just almost seems like they're happy that they can do this. Yeah, we're like the Israelis, and this is something again that I'm worried about, and maybe is leading us into war with Iran. It's like the recent Israeli successes, and they really are successes, not against Iran. I think that whole thing is phony, that they obliterated their air defense system. But against Syria and against Lebanon, has maybe even kind of, inspired a false confidence, that I think I spoke about last time, but also a certain amount of envy. This is something, we can do this too. The Israelis, they're so great. Remember, Netanyahu gave his gift to President Trump was a gold-plated pager.
Right.
And, that, I think, again, that speaks volumes. And now Trump is saying, okay, yeah, we're going to do to Iran what Israel, it's Israel and Turkey, really, most of all, Turkey more than Israel, but what was done to Syria. We weakened them by sanctions. We've got these connections with various insurgent groups within Iran. And we're going to decapitate the leadership, and we're going to, drop these 27,000-pound bunker buster bombs, and we'll just show we're just going to be Israel on steroids. I think I'm afraid that's the way they're thinking, and I'm very worried about what will happen.
It is scary. I mean, you brought up the fact, World War II, there was the bombing of Dresden and Hamburg, and obviously the fire bombings of Tokyo and Japan, and then of course the Nagasaki and Hiroshima atom bomb. These were horrible incidents. But we also have to realize that this was done when we were fighting a world war that was going on for 4 years, and tens of millions of people have died already in this conflict, before we dropped the atom bomb. And I don't believe that was a justified thing to do, but this is, you can put it in that context. Yeah. But what we're seeing here is the Houthis, how many Americans have they killed? The Palestinians, the people in Gaza or in the West Bank, or people in Beirut, Hezbollah, Hamas, how many Americans have they killed? No, but we're just ready to jump straight into this without even, for what? For no real reason, because Netanyahu says we should? That's what's so crazy to me. It's this should be making a decision like this. Do we go after Iran with overwhelming force, and we use tactical nuclear bombs straight from the get-go because we know we got to hit them hard, take the Israeli route, go for the jugular? How can you justify that when there's been no attack on your country or your people from these countries? That's just insane to me that we would be willing to jump to that. But that's where I feel like we're headed. And just the like you say, just how flippant we are with being okay with what's happening in Gaza, and just be like, yeah, that's just, we got to get rid of them. These are just bad people. We bothered them. We got to wipe them out. No mercy.
Yeah.
It's nuts. Why? How's this? How did we get to this stage? You said you think it's Israel has corrupted us like this, or is it something else that is?
Yeah.
How did we become so immoral?
Well, I think there's no question that the Israeli-U.S. Relationship has been corrupting for the U.S. and corrupting for Israel, for the reasons that we said. It's just that this unconditional support for the most extreme elements within, or, the not necessarily the most extreme, at least that's not how it started, but for the hardline Zionists within Israel has corrupted Israel. I mean, it's strengthened their position vis-a-vis those that were willing to negotiate and, to avoid a military path. And now, Israel has reached a stage where there really is no voice for peace within Israel. But it's also been corrupting for the U.S. Again, it's, we have tied ourselves to Israel and with consequences that we can see, now the complicity in a genocide, but then also just an adoption of the Israeli approach, which is increasingly cruel. That just shows no regard for civilian life. And what can I say? I don't want to put the blame all on Israel, because obviously there has to be sort of like a willingness on our part. It's not like we were forced to do that. We could have rejected it. We could have said, oh no, we're not going down that path. But I think, there's always this temptation to throw, all moral qualms aside and just to engage in the raw exercise of power. And Israel has given us that excuse, kind of given us that opportunity, and we've taken it. We didn't have to take it. I can just remember having a conversation with a friend a long time ago, probably a good 30 years, but he said he admitted that he got a lot of vicarious pleasure out of Israel's military exploits. And that really stuck with me. And I think that's true. It's just like there have always been a lot of people in the U.S. that said, damn, I wish we could be like the Israelis. Why do we always, wring our hands and hesitate and, just, punch them hard. Of course, we're talking about a lot more than punching, but you see the picture. And now we can really see that whole, I think, like the desire of that friend of mine from decades ago. It's come to fruition in that we really are, engaging in the same kind of behavior. And Israel has actually become much uglier than it used to be. And rather than recoil from that, unfortunately, we are, we seem to be eager to emulate them.
Can we become a moral country again? Because I feel like we were definitely a more moral country in the past. I mean, but it's just amazing how we used to, part of being an American was this belief that we are the land of the free and that we were a moral country and a force for good. But we have slipped so far from that. I think it's hard. It takes a while for people to maybe open their eyes, but a lot of us are having our eyes opened. And just realizing, what are we doing? That we are becoming one of the most immoral forces in the world right now. I think second to Israel at this point. So it's, I mean, is there any coming back from that? I mean,
I don't know. Again, I just, again, like this whole, I think there is, but it's going to be a wrenching, maybe it's going to require some kind of revolution or some quasi-revolution. It's not going to be a small adjustment in policy, obviously. It's just that we have been, as John Mearsheimer has put it, joined at the hip with Israel. But it's even become more than that. It just seemed like we're emulating all their worst ways. And you have people, I think it's that same Florida legislator that you're talking about, is just saying that, that basically like Israel's interests are somehow indistinguishable from U.S. interests. That's become, they sort of become like Israel is like more American than America is. That's the way a lot of people are starting to think, and it almost seems to be the way that President Trump thinks. How can you decide you're going to put America first? Well, it certainly doesn't look like that. But in their minds, like it's just like if you put Israel first, you're putting America first, but you can't distinguish between them. Now, this is going to, so, we're talking about sort of like a real fusion of identities or an imagined fusion. Of course, the Israelis, I think, are probably more realistic. They're just saying, wow, these Americans, I don't know why they're going along with this, but this is great. We'll go on this ride here. But the Americans really imagine that, that they're like twins or, they're even more than that. They become one in some sense. I think that's not true, but that's the way people think. So it's going to be, I don't know what it's going to take, but it's going to be, it'll tear apart what, the current fabric of society and politics right now. And I think we have to go through that. That's a scary process, but we just have to. I mean, this is sort of like something that's infected our body politic, like a really serious cancer. And it's just not going to, you can't just pop a pill and it'll go away. You can, it's going to require radical surgery, and that's never going to be pretty. I really don't know how it's going to be done, but it does have to happen one way or another.
We need Thomas Massey to become president. It's the only hope. Yeah, it's I kind of think about how other countries handled Germany when it committed the Holocaust. How it reacted afterwards. What will happen to the United States? Will we take that sort of Germany route? Do you think that there will be a moment where we recognize that we've done something horrible? Are we going to be able to whitewash this? How long can we whitewash this? At some point, the truth of what we are being involved in Gaza is going to come out, and there's going to be some type of bill to pay. And I'm just wondering what that is and how the country is going to handle it. Will we apologize for our sins? Are we going to shift the blame somewhere else? Or, there could be a danger of putting all this anger towards the Israelis if people start saying like, oh, this is because Zionism and the Israeli lobby AIPAC have infected our government and have twisted or might have manipulated us to do these things. And that could be dangerous too. We talk about anti-Semitism being a problem now. Think about what it'll be afterward. It could potentially be afterwards. So there's just... Yeah, I don't know. What do you think will happen? How will we handle it?
Well, I mean, I think, you put your finger on a number of possibilities. There can be a real backlash against Jewish power. One thing, again, I've been reading a lot of these Haaretz articles, and it just seems like most of these Haaretz liberals, some exceptions, but most of them are concerned about against domestic issues, which are important enough, but they just don't see the elephant in the room, and that's their genocide. That's the thing. If you're worried about Israel's reputation and you're worried about anti-Semitism, that should be your number one concern. I mean, it's just like the longer it goes on, the more likely that there's, this hatred for your people is going to increase over time. I mean, that's just, and a few of them understand that. Again, like people like Gideon Levy. But most of them don't, they just don't want to see it. And, again, that's one thing, but another is like you say, you could end up with something similar to what happened in Germany. Of course, Germany was actually militarily conquered. It's hard to see that happening to the U.S. It's there, ensconced between two great oceans. But there could be some kind of revolution. And, after a series of all kind of catastrophic events, and people will just wake up to the fact that our close ties to Israel have been disastrous for us. And so not only would there be, a focus on the Jewish element, but also just on our past, the past government actions. And, looking at like the case of Germany, I don't think that's been entirely healthy. I mean, the problem is like, you can have you can have an alliance that can be right about some things and very wrong about something else. I'm just thinking about the Republicans and Trump in particular right now. Some of his ideas are good. Maybe they're not being executed very well, but I think a lot of his instincts are very healthy and are the reason that he got elected. But Israel could actually bring that all down. And there could be such angry against, at some point in the future, such anger against Israel and our ties to Israel and the catastrophe that ended in, that you can just that everything, things that are good about our culture or about can be attacked as well as those that are bad. It just, unfortunately, it's rare that you see a balanced approach. That just doesn't seem to be human nature. Certainly doesn't seem to be the nature of U.S. politics right now. So I don't know. It's just it could end up very badly. Even a coming to terms may not be so pretty. I think there has to be a coming to terms, but it could. It could have its own ugly underside. Again, it's just like the baby gets thrown out with the bathwater. That's the sad thing. Like somebody like J.D. Vance, who clearly is an intelligent person, and I think would be actually make a much better president than Trump would. I'll be honest. Kind of has a similar outlook, but I think he knows how to carry through. Like if he did the tariffs, he would do it more carefully. If he conducted negotiations with Russia, I think he would do it methodically and make some real progress. He wouldn't be so haphazard in his approach. But he too, suffers. There's always this Israeli exception. Like again, he's talking about free speech, and he gave that very powerful speech in Munich. About the loss of, or the decline of democracy in Europe. But then we see the same thing when it comes to Israel. That's always the exception. That's the blind spot. It's a blind spot for Vance as well, and that's what could actually bring them all down. Even when they're right about some things, it's just they have wedded themselves to something that's so terrible that it could undo everything that the potential good that they could cause.